I have a problem with Jura. And I'm probably not alone in saying that, because it's kind of almost trendy to hate on the Isle of Jura distillery at the moment. It is these days. But I do think that Jura has great potential, but the whiskey that we get from them is often young, too young, it's often rough, and seemingly just without direction. And just flying off on a tangent here, another one of my passions apart from whiskey is photography. And one of the things that people often say about photography is when you're trying to take a photo, trying to compose your shot, you need to think about what you're trying to say. You can't just take a photo of a scene, a view that looks good to you and press the shutter button and get a good photo. You need a vision, a direction. You need to have a clear view of what you're trying to say. And I think that in a way that applies to whiskey as well. And I think that a lot of the whiskies that we get from Jura, you can't tell what they're trying to say. You can't tell what they're trying to do, what they're trying to create. You just get this feeling that it's a young whiskey with a few flavours. Worse than that, a lot of the stuff that we get from Jura lately, it's often low strength stuff with non-craft presentations. Even the expensive stuff is low ABV and poorly presented, which if you expect us to pay 70, 80, 200 pounds a bottle, it's not going to fly. To be fair to Jura though, as I said, they have got huge potential as a distillery, and I think that it does seem like they're trying to be proactive, because we're seeing a lot of new expressions over the last maybe 5 years from Jura, and they're trying a lot of different things. They're trying to get something to work. Sadly, I think that we're seeing a lot of unsuccessful attempts from Jura at finding out what the more demanding customer wants from a whiskey. But the one thing that they don't often seem to try is just making well-matured, straightforward whiskey with age statements and good presentations. And I do wonder if that's possibly partly because they feel committed to that stack 'em high, sell 'em cheap supermarket environment. Because I would imagine, I don't know, but I would imagine that probably the majority of Jura whiskey gets sold on discount in places like supermarkets. Because when was the last time you heard any whiskey geek raving about Jura? Unless it's some really rare limited edition single cask thing. We're not nice to Jura. It is trendy to trash Jura, and it's kind of deserved. But I think with Jura now probably making a large part of their revenue from the cheapies on heavy discounts in Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda, all of those places, probably once you make a sizable part of your income from that low margin commodity offerings, it probably makes you reluctant to do anything that adds significant cost or reduces output. And that's a large part of the heart of what I was getting at when I made that comment on that Ralphie video that he talked about in one of his videos, where I said that supermarkets are kind of the most hostile and harmful things to the whiskey industry, because they kind of encourage distilleries to aim low and stay low. Anyway, Jura 10-year-old. It looks nice. I'm trying to be positive. But the box, it does look nice. It looks like a still. Like a mildly polished whiskey still. It's got some contour marks on there. It shows you the bottle shape. I have always liked the bottle shape of Jura. There's a little bit of blurb on the back there. Welcome to Jura, blah blah blah. This is what the island looks like. No one lives here. It's mostly deer. And we make some whiskey. Do you really need a cardboard tube with a metal top and bottom on a whiskey that sells for £25? No, you don't. I do like the bottle though. The bottle's a really nice ergonomic design. That just fits your hand. It's lovely. It's like a giant hip flask. The label's pretty nice as well. I think that this presentation is better than if you've been drinking whiskey for a while, in the UK at least, you'll be very familiar with the old Jura Origin and Superstition, which had that crappy plastic thing glued to the front of the bottle. I'm not really a fan of plastic glued to the front of my whiskey bottles. It's very tacky. It's very Dalmore. But I don't mind this. This is pretty good, and there's some decent details on there. Wonderful bottle shape. We know that this is 40% ABV, sadly, but it does have an age statement. It's 10 years old, and it's got at least some peat in there, and it's matured in American white oak bourbon barrels, and it's finished in aged Oloroso sherry butts. It doesn't say anything about colouring, but the fact that it looks like iron brew tells you the answer on that one. Doesn't say anything about non-chill filtration, but at 40%, and the fact that you can see through it, hello, you can see me through there, that tells you what you need to know about chill filtration. As for the price on this one, the full price is, I think, £35 or around about 35, but realistically, if you live in the UK and you buy whiskey from supermarkets, then you're going to get this one for about £25. Let's get some in the glass, see what we've got. Don't actually know what they mean by aged Oloroso sherry butts. What does aged mean in that sentence? Are the casks old? Is the whiskey finished for a really long time? Doesn't really make sense. But it is really good that they tell us that this is... They're basically saying that it's matured in bourbon casks and then finished in Oloroso. So it's a good level of transparency. It's a step up from your usual commodity whiskey offerings. So Jura 10-year-old, on the nose. How bad can it be? And the surprising answer is actually surprisingly nice. Getting some salty oranges on the nose, so that's probably evidence of those Oloroso sherry casks. Also getting some apple, some nice floral sherry notes. Floral, nutty sherry. Perhaps some almonds and pecans, something like that. And being a Jura, I'm also getting some of that almost trademark Jura, slightly bitter vegetal peat, kind of like a cabbage and starchy potato peatiness. It's also slightly musty on the nose, which, to be fair, adds quite a nice little dose of character to this whiskey. I think some people, and quite rightly so, might describe this whiskey as slightly fainty, which some people would describe as a flaw with this whiskey, but I don't know if I would go that far. But having been to Jura myself, I think that the fact that this does come across as slightly musty and fainty is probably evidence that the cut points in whiskey distillation have at least as much impact and flavour as the height of the stills, because anyone that's been to Jura and done the distillery tour will know that the stills at the Jura distillery are absolutely enormous. So you would expect a light and refined style of whiskey from Jura, and that's not what you get at all. Other notes that I'm getting on the nose of this whiskey, there's a slight saltiness, perhaps salted caramel, and also a nice little malty character. So not too bad, doing quite well so far. Let's see how it tastes. So on the palate, really follows through from the nose. There's a sweet caramel note, which I'm trying my best to not think of as coming through from that spirit caramel that they've added into this, because I would imagine there's probably been quite a lot. There's also a little smokiness on the palate of this one, as well as more of that peated cabbage and a slight grassy quality on the palate of this whiskey. It's also pleasantly peppery, which is, it's actually something that I'm getting more and more into. One of the whiskies that I reviewed recently is the Cutty Sark Prohibition Edition, and pepperiness is something that I've had on quite a few Glen Scotias as well, and it's actually one of the things that I like most about a lot of the Glen Scotias that I've had, that pepperiness. And I think there's a little bit of that in here. There's also a nice maltiness on the palate, some fruitiness as well, which a lot of that is probably coming through from that Oloroso sherry finishing period. So some notes of things like fruit squash. I think that because it's a low strength whiskey at 40%, it struggles that little bit more on the palate than it did on the nose, but there's just enough flavour to this, and probably more flavour than you'd expect for 40% ABV. As for the finish, I think that it's slightly watery, which you would probably expect from most 40% whiskies, but not awful, and actually medium length when it comes to that finish. Just going to have another little sip. Slightly bitter on the finish, almost sulphury perhaps, and I do wonder if that's coming through from that slightly fainty character that I picked up on the palate earlier. And again, more of that generally smoky caramel malt character. So on the plus side with this one, it exceeds my expectations of a 10-year-old Jura. And quite importantly, I think this is easily identifiable as a Jura whiskey, and I really like that when you've got trademark notes that really stand out as a house style, and you can tell where a whiskey is from. That's a fantastic thing. I think that some people will have issues with that vegetal peat note. For example, Rene from Saulag Whiskey Review, I think that this one will probably disagree with him a little bit because of that, but I quite like it. I think that it's character and it's interesting, and I think that for distilleries that want to produce single malts, it's important for them to be unique and embrace their individuality. And I think that this Jura does that. And going back to what I was saying earlier about a distillery making whiskey and having a vision and a direction and knowing what it's trying to say, that goes a long way towards ticking that box. Compared to the Juras that we've had recently at the low end before this, I think that this is a clear step up above the Origin and the Superstition, which I don't think you can get anymore. And I'd actually say that I think this is probably, this 10-year-old is better at being a 10-year-old whiskey than the current Jura 18 is at being an 18-year-old whiskey, if that makes sense. And I think that even though this is a cheap 40% budget whiskey, I probably enjoy this new Jura 10-year-old more than I enjoyed that Jura 18-year-old that I had in the advent calendar whenever. To be fair to Jura, it's probably much better than most of what they've done recently. It has to be said that it is still a little weak and quite watery, but I think that this new presentation of the Jura 10-year-old, that's actually been around for a little while now, I've been a little slow on this one, it's becoming a very decent basic 10-year-old whiskey. I'd say that all in all, this one is probably about equal to the Highland Park 12-year-old. And if they just up the ABV on this one, it's probably going to be around about equal to the current Talisker 10-year-old. With its little bit of sherry, little bit of bourbon, little bit of peat, little bit of salt and funk. If they bottled this at 46%, it might even be a possible Springbank 10 alternative. So as for a grade, bearing in mind that this is currently still only the bare legal minimum 40% ABV, going to go with a C+ on this one, which is the top end of what I would call good. So that's a decent effort, and it's an improvement. Although it does still need work, especially that ABV. But I think that for £25, which realistically is the proper price for this here in the UK, it's already a surprisingly recommendable daily dram for that low price point. Hopefully, fingers crossed, this is going to be the start of a trend for Jura. Let me know what you think of this one if you've had it. Thanks for watching, and cheers.
Woo-hoo.